General Gnaeus Julius Agricola stood on the wet heather at the very edge of humanity. It was beginning to rain and a misty drizzle was being carried inland on the saline air. This truly was a savage place. A place where the gods had not worked their benevolence as they had on his Mediterranean home. He looked out across the deep waters of the outer edge of the known world. The campaign was over, but Agricola had one last command to undertake. After 4 decades of sporadic conquest and numerous setbacks, the Roman army was poised to enter the highlands of northern Caledonia to wipe out the remaining native resistance and determine the limits of Europe. Agricola would go on to confirm that the British landmass was an island by navigating unfamiliar seas, exploring undiscovered coastlines, and making contact with previously unknown peoples. Calgacus, the leader of these people, the one they called the Swordsman, had said that beyond these shores lay only rocks and sea. That was probably true, but as he watched the rain clouds roll back over the northwestern sunset, Agricola wondered. He cast his mind back 30 years to when Emperor Claudius had just begun his conquest of Britain. Agricola had been a young student at Massalia, ancient Marseille, a Greek-founded city. Under Roman rule, it was a respected center of learning, with a prominent statue of the legendary Greek seafarer Pytheas. 4 centuries earlier, in the time of Alexander the Great, Pytheas had entered the Atlantic and explored the furthest limits of the ocean beyond Britain. But he had claimed to have seen a further great landmass positioned far beyond. It was his belief that 3 vast islands formed the North Atlantic Isles: Britain, Ireland, and Thule. Pytheas states that he set foot on every part of Britain. He also gives an account of Thule and describes a region where he says the land, sea, and air are no longer separate elements. Instead, there is a thick compound resembling a sea lung, which suspends itself over ocean and land, merging and binding elemental matter. This material cannot be traveled over or sailed through. In the long half-light before the first stars appeared, Agricola looked out at the darkening horizon. Was the legendary island of Ultima Thule out there, at the very rim of the globe, where daylight lingered? And so he mused to himself, if he had come this far, why not go further? Beneath him, the Roman fleet had reassembled in a deep inlet to shelter from a sudden autumn storm. The war galleys and support vessels were making ready to range northward along the furthest seaboards of Caledonia. They would support the legions who were pushing forward into the highlands and forests. Agricola watched as the ships shifted on an incoming tide. He would have told his fleet commander what to expect out there. Roman knowledge of the North Sea suggested the latitudes beyond Britain would be subject to horrendous storms, carrying frozen currents and biting cold winds from the far north. And beyond Britain, the sea became cold and began to solidify. This process began with the platelets of floating sea ice that resembled a shoal of encroaching jellyfish. But as the cold increased, these ice plates merged into sheets that could immobilize, then crush timber vessels. Agricola had seen with his own eyes the white mass of a Caledonian sea mist hanging over an early frost. Truly, a compound resembling a sea lung, as Pytheas had claimed some 4 centuries prior. And so, with the Roman military about to encounter Ultima Thule, would the Roman explorers sent out by Agricola soon tread the beaches of this remote, mysterious, and semi-mythical land? But of course, this was not the first time that the Romans had explored beyond the limits of the known world or crossed the boundaries of knowledge. A long sequence of adventure, conquest, and ambition had led Rome and its armies far beyond the familiar, to the boundaries of the unknown. Centuries of expansion had pushed the eternal city to the ends of the earth, not only to the far north, but far east, west, and south too. And so this is that story. This is the story of the edges of the empire. The Roman soldiers' diet was mainly wheat. Some sources tell us that salt was so prized that soldiers in the Republic were paid in salt, and this was the root of the word salary. This video has been sponsored by Factor, the best, healthiest meal delivery service out there, and something that those legionaries would probably have appreciated. Personally, Factor is great for saving me from my terrible vice of unhealthy takeaway food. Factor's healthy menus are updated weekly and include more than 27 meals and 33 add-on options. You can choose your favorite meals, or let Factor craft your order based on your taste preference and meal history. They offer keto, calorie smart, chef's choice, and vegan and veggie options. It's an amazing time saver, and meal plans range from 4 to 18 meals per week, so you can add more or reduce the number depending on your specific needs. You can even skip a week if you need to. Your meal is delivered fresh, never frozen, directly to your door. Just heat, eat, and enjoy. So head to factor75.com or click the link below to use code VOICE50 and get 50% off your first Factor box. Thanks to Factor for supporting history content on YouTube. In the 3rd century BC, the embattled Roman state was largely confined to Italy, with a powerful network of Italian city-state allies. But in the century that followed, proud legions captured and subdued Macedonia, seized the prosperous island of Sicily, and laid claim to territories in eastern Spain. And finally, after generations of persistent rivalry and warfare, they closed in on the already beaten and beleaguered Carthaginians on the coast of North Africa. Following a 3-year siege, the monumental conflict between these two opposing empires was at last concluded. The Roman general Scipio Aemilianus oversaw the final brutal capture and destruction of the seaport of Carthage. He gave orders that the Roman army should burn, destroy, and demolish everything in their path. During 6 days of savage fighting in the city streets, the order was repeatedly given to clear the thoroughfares. Wounded and dying citizens were dragged away and heaped along with corpses and debris from collapsing buildings. Then, both living and dead bodies were cast into pits filled with rubble and other charred remains. Appian writes, "To make the streets passable, they cleared the debris with axes, mattocks, and pronged tools. With these iron instruments, the dead and the living were rolled and dragged along like debris before being hurled together into pits. The trenches were filled with the dead and still living." Finally, over 50,000 traumatized survivors who had taken refuge in an inner citadel surrendered. They were secured in the iron chains of the Roman slave dealers. Surrounded by his closest advisors, Scipio oversaw this final destruction of the city from a distant vantage point. As the ruins of Carthage smoldered down to embers and ashes, Scipio is said to have suddenly stood very still in quiet reflection. The battle was over. The threat of death was gone and the thrill of killing had subsided. He became lost in thought. Was this the ultimate destiny of all empires? Appian records, Scipio beheld the final destruction of a city which had flourished 700 years from its foundation. It had ruled over so many lands, islands, and seas. It had been prosperous with great armies and fleets, elephants and wealth of money. It had been equal to the mightiest monarchies, but surpassed them all in bravery and ambition. Now, the city had met its end in a final and complete destruction. Scipio, beholding this spectacle, is said to have shed tears and publicly lamented the destiny of his enemy. A Greek advisor called Polybius, who was standing nearby, overheard Scipio mutter a quote from Homer, a verse from the Iliad concerning the destruction of the legendary city of Troy. The great campaign was over. But what next? Perhaps, thought Polybius, a new Odyssey was about to begin. Polybius turned his back on the broken city and looked out towards the sea, where new possibilities awaited. Could he become a new Odysseus? Rome was victorious, Carthage was gone, and its possessions in North Africa were now the property of the expanding Roman Empire. The sea lanes leading into the Atlantic were suddenly open to Roman shipping. But what unknown lands lay beyond the Mediterranean and the fabled Pillars of Hercules? Scipio was determined to destroy all remnants of Carthage, and this included its diaspora. The Carthaginians had established small colonies and trade stations on the arid outer shores of North Africa, modern-day Morocco. Had these Atlantic connections provided the Carthaginians with their great wealth and good fortune? Perhaps. So Scipio offered his Greek advisor Polybius command of several Roman war galleys and instructed him to find the westward limits of Carthaginian power. And so his journey west began. By following the African coast, Polybius passed the high Atlas mountain range and prepared to enter the Atlantic. But he was crossing through more than a physical limitation. He was intruding into the domain of gods, myths, heroes, and monsters. Deities always existed where practical experience faltered and common knowledge ended. As they passed into uncharted regions, Polybius and his small fleet, like Odysseus, prepared themselves for supernatural hazards, as well as physical dangers. To begin with, it was said that the world-bearing Titan, Atlas, held the weight of the sky on his shoulders. Indeed, the fossilized remains of this godlike giant might yet be seen in the high Atlas mountains. Perhaps its massive form would be glimpsed as a vast mountain column projecting upwards, far beyond the tallest peaks. The Romans strained their eyes looking inland at the ranges to discern the shape or form of the primordial Titan. At the edge of the Mediterranean, a high cliff-like promontory hove into view on the European coast. This was the Rock of Gibraltar, which formed one flank of the legendary Pillars of Hercules, the gateway between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. It was said that the legendary demigod Hercules had cut a channel through a mountain to join the seas and enter the Atlantic, though other accounts suggested Hercules had merely fortified an existing sea passage, so that giant oceanic monsters might not stray into the peaceful Mediterranean. This rock-hewn passage was the strait through which Polybius and his ships now passed. As he passed this legendary spot, Polybius must have considered the reports of his Greek forebears, who had themselves heard second-hand accounts from Carthaginian seafarers. For it had been in the 6th century BC that a Carthaginian commander named Hanno the Navigator had voyaged beyond the Pillars of Hercules and explored the western seaboard of the African continent. Hanno had left an account of his voyage. This had been translated into Greek and circulated among Roman authorities in an abbreviated form. It was said that Hanno had commanded a settler fleet intended to colonize distant regions, but south of Morocco the Carthaginians had encountered only a bleak and hostile coastline. The Greek writer Arrian read the translated report. As Hanno sailed south, he encountered crippling obstacles, a lack of water, scorching heat, and streams of lava gushing into the sea. Perhaps these explorers had sailed beyond the southern limit of the vast Sahara Desert and witnessed volcanic lava spilling into the sea at Mount Cameroon. Even more terrifying were the human-like creatures encountered in the region. Hanno had reported, in this lagoon was another island, full of savages. Most of them were women with hairy bodies, whom our interpreters called gorillas. Although we chased them, we could not catch any males. They all escaped since they were good climbers and could defend themselves with stones. However, we caught 3 women. They refused to follow those who carried them off, biting and clawing at them. So we killed them and flayed them and brought their skins back to Carthage. We could not sail any further because our provisions were running short. These pelt-like skins had been taken to Carthage and hung as curiosities in the temple of the goddess Tanit. macabre trophies lingering on as a testament to a strange, never-to-be-repeated voyage. For almost 4 centuries, the hides had hung silently in the shrine until the destruction of Carthage, when the Romans looted the city and burnt the sacred temple. By contrast, the temperate shores of Western Europe were explored by Carthaginian merchants who sailed to distant northern islands in pursuit of valuable resources. Somewhere out in the Atlantic Ocean were trade routes to the distant Isle of Albion and Ierne. The Celtic peoples of southern Britain supplied essential tin, which was alloyed with commonly found copper to produce sturdy bronze metal. Other strange materials reached the Mediterranean through these Atlantic sea lanes, including valuable Baltic amber. This was thought to be the congealed rays of the setting sun. Sometimes strange tropical insects could be seen in the solidified center of this highly desirable substance. Perhaps they were evidence of an undiscovered tropical zone in the faraway frozen north. And so it was that after the destruction of Carthage, Scipio sent out his small exploratory Roman fleet, commanded by Polybius. Passing cautiously through the Pillars of Hercules, they sailed south around the coast of Morocco. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder records. After sailing round the coast, Polybius reported that, in a westerly direction beyond Mount Atlas, there are forests teeming with wild animals that Africa produces. Beyond this is the river Non, which is full of crocodiles and hippopotami. From the Non, there is a line of mountains going right up to a high peak that the Greeks call the Chariot of the Gods. With their greatest rival, Carthage, removed from power, the Romans had finally reached the western gateway of the Mediterranean and entered the Atlantic Ocean. The coastal ports of western Gaul now within their reach, a new direction for exploration, contact, and conquest had been revealed. The routes of Roman fortune were now opened into the west. But this was just the beginning. In another region of the ancient world, another leading general of the Roman Republic was also suddenly overcome by emotion at his very moment of supreme victory. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, stood in shock as he was presented with the semi-embalmed corpse of his royal enemy, Mithridates. Those given the task of preserving the royal remains had failed to remove the brain tissue, and the putrid objects set before him filled Pompey with a deep revulsion. Nevertheless, one of the greatest foes the Romans had ever faced was dead. Pompey's grand campaign for vengeance, exploration, and conquest was over. The year was 65 BC, and yet another great kingdom had fallen to the rising power of Rome and its relentless legions. The Pontic king Mithridates VI had been betrayed by his allies and subjects in the Crimean kingdom of the Cimmerian Bosphorus. This had been his last refuge, and the king had ended his own life rather than suffer humiliation as a captive in Rome. In his pursuit of Mithridates, Pompey the Great had entered the Caucasus Mountains, passed through the dark forests of Colchis, and explored the snow-capped mountains between the turbulent Black Sea and the mysterious Caspian region. Now that the arch-enemy of Rome was dead, the general reflected on the extraordinary discoveries he had made in these far eastern territories. The heavily forested territory of Colchis on the west coast of the Black Sea had always been a dangerous and largely unknown region, a wilderness zone where tall, dense forests fringed mountain ranges. Near where the Rioni River emptied into the Black Sea was an ancient Greek harbour town named Phasis, a frontier trading outpost that retained its wild and dangerous character throughout antiquity. Statues of classical gods stood in the harbour and town centre, displaying the strange influence of barbaric local cults. The site was a hub for numerous merchants and fugitives who mingled with guides, translators, and dubious representatives from the nearby mountain tribes. And so it was Phasis that had served as the outer limit of the furthest Greek voyages. Indeed, not even Alexander the Great had dared to enter this region. This meant Colchis was the subject of long-standing myth and legend, once again a region thought to encroach on the realm of the gods. Many in Rome must have wondered, what had Pompey found out there at the limits of the known world? Greek myth had long warned of the dangers of exceeding human knowledge contrary to the will of the gods. It was said that the Titan Prometheus had fashioned mankind from clay, giving his creation thought and reason. But this primeval deity had suffered eternal punishment for giving his prodigies the key to technology, an understanding of fire. On the orders of Zeus, Prometheus had supposedly been chained to a rock in the furthest reaches of the Caucasus Mountains. Bound on a high mountain peak, a giant eagle descended each day to tear out the innards of the helpless immortal. Ancient Colchis was too immortalized in the story of Jason and the Argonauts, who sought the Golden Fleece in this forbidding region. Accounts of gold dust and giant dragon serpents filled the minds of Greek writers regarding these unexplored mountains. The main anchor from Jason's ship, the Argo, was on display in the center of Phasis as a monument to the ancient myth. Some visitors doubted the authenticity of this object since it was made of relatively unweathered iron, but these skeptics were shown fragments of an older stone object that better fitted the antiquity of the myth. And so this was the place where King Mithridates had fled to rally his tribal allies against Rome. And this was where Pompey had to follow to defeat his great enemy. But Pompey was also eager to lead his soldiers into a land of myth and legend. According to Appian, Pompey wanted to gain knowledge of the country visited by the Argonauts, Castor and Pollux and Hercules. He especially desired to see the place where they say that Prometheus was fastened to Mount Caucasus. From the Pontic kingdom, Pompey marched on and invaded the small kingdom of Caucasian Iberia. Colchis was now cut off from Armenia and Iran, but Pompey did not push onwards to the coast of the mysterious Caspian Sea. Instead, he headed inland to find the Rioni River and capture the port city of Phasis. This connected him with the Roman fleet operating in the Black Sea, but once more he discovered that Mithridates had fled. Pompey thought of pursuing the fugitive with the Roman fleet and sailing past Mount Strobius where Prometheus had been chained by Zeus. Would a Roman general dare look upon the site where the creator of mankind had withstood his eternal punishment? But suddenly, a new plan entered the mind of Pompey. He realized that he would only retain his command while Mithridates remained a threat to Rome. While the defeated king was confined to the far north, the Near East was exposed to immediate Roman conquest. Plutarch reports, Pompey was seized by a great and eager passion to claim Syria and march through Arabia to the Red Sea. His victorious career would therefore touch the ocean which surrounds the world on all sides. For in Africa he had been the first to conquer as far as the outer sea, and in Spain he had made the Atlantic Ocean the western boundary of the Roman domains. So now Pompey put his army in motion, determined to reach the Red Sea and complete the circuit of his military expeditions. Pompey marched south with his legions, seizing Syria and making the kingdom of Judea subject to the Roman Empire. In Jerusalem, Pompey and his entourage entered the great temple of the one true God of the Jews. They ignored all appeals and threats by the priests and defied the holy law by gazing upon the artifacts of the Lord. As his men held back the protesting high priest, Pompey inhaled the heavy scent of hallowed incense and stepped forward to vanish behind the veil that covered the darkness of the inner sanctuary. His soldiers waited for the general to reappear with the idol of the Lord God Almighty of the Jews. Would he smash it before the distraught priests, or carry it back to be mocked in a great triumphal procession through the streets of Rome? Time passed, but he did not immediately reappear. Josephus records that Pompey simply examined the artifacts preserved in that holy place, but removed nothing. He reappeared empty-handed and then departed in silence. But Pompey continued the march south. The Nabatean kingdom in northwest Arabia was next to submit to Rome, and the legions were encamped near the rock-cut city of Petra. All the threats of divine curses and catastrophes had proven false, and the Near East was now under imperial control. The region belonged to Rome, and the outer sea was within their grasp. But the campaign led by Pompey had far exceeded its objectives. This was irrefutable when news reached him that Mithridates was already dead. There had been an uprising in the Cimmerian Bosphorus, and the king had ended his life as a final escape from the pursuits of the Romans. The war was done. Pompey received the messengers and was presented with the semi-embalmed corpse of his enemy. But the general chose not to look upon the putrid remains or reflect upon this man's great fall from regal power and glory. For it was now he realized that the exploratory aspect of his mission must also cease. Pompey had failed to encounter any monsters or meet any living divinities in the distant Caucasus, but at Pharsis, the Romans did find Indian commodities among the goods trafficked overland from the Caspian Sea. These Indian goods came from Bactria via the Oxus River to the Caspian coasts. Pompey had discovered a possible route to India that could bypass Iran and the rival Parthian Empire. But who amongst ordinary merchants and travelers would dare traverse this route through distant and dangerous lands? Not Pompey. 15 years later, he finally met his fate in the East. Defeated by Julius Caesar in the Roman civil wars, the dejected general was betrayed by his own officers and murdered. When his severed head was presented to Caesar, the dictator too turned away in disgust and horror. Despite the political conflict, Caesar mourned the loss of his former friend and colleague. From that moment on, it would be Caesar and his dynasty who would decide the fate and further expansion of the Roman Empire. Eudaimon Arabia in ancient Yemen had been the main harbour of the mysterious Sabaeans. But now the harbour buildings were engulfed in flames, sending high columns of acrid smoke ascending into the sky. For Eudaimon Arabia had been the victim of a Roman raid designed to test the logistics and feasibility of a maritime campaign route that could reach Outer Arabia. It was the prelude to war. Planned as a precursor to a larger invasion of southern Arabia led by the Roman commander Aelius Gallus, the attack was ordered by Augustus, the successor to Julius Caesar and the first true emperor of Rome. But what great prize or knowledge had brought Roman conquest to this distant region? The answer could be found in the acrid stench that was streaming from the harbour and rising up into the darkening sky, like some perverse sacrifice to the gods of war. Incense. Arabian incense was sacred to many cultures. Whether you were Roman, Greek, Jew, or Persian, when the pungent smoke released from burning desiccated tree saps ascended skyward, it carried holy fragrances towards the heavens. Indeed, incense was a much more appealing offering to the many gods than the odour of animal sacrifice. But it was not easy to obtain. Arabia was a remote land of extreme deserts, and the stunted trees that produced this sap grew only on its southern coasts. The cliffs and promontories of this seaboard were difficult to approach from the coast, and the region was seldom entered by outsiders, and so the hardened drops of sap produced by lacerating the wiry incense trees was sent inland through desert trails to reach distant trade stations near the Mediterranean or the Persian Gulf. These incense trails crossed 1,000 miles through restricted caravan routes, where Arabian merchants carried their precious loads on heavily burdened camel teams. Incense was so valuable that even small pouches of this alluring substance could only be purchased using multiple pouches of gold and silver coins. Early accounts of the biblical King Solomon describe how he received an incense caravan from the Queen of Sheba. And Sheba came to Jerusalem with a very great caravan, with camels that bore incense and very much gold and precious stones. And when she was come to Solomon, she communed with him concerning all that was in her heart. Indeed, in 332 BC, Alexander the Great acquired vast stocks of Arabian incense when he captured the Phoenician city of Tyre on the Syrian seaboard. A decade later, with his Persian conquests complete, Alexander had planned to seize southern Arabia by launching a fleet from the Persian Gulf. But his sudden, unexplained death in Babylon had ended the invasion plans. 3 centuries would pass before another great ruler would attempt the conquest. And so, it was 25 BC when the Emperor Augustus planned to surpass Alexander and add Arabia to the Roman domains. Although this was an economic decision as much as anything else. 5 years earlier, when Egypt became an imperial province, there had been a boom in consumer spending across the empire, when vast wealth was released from the Ptolemaic royal treasuries to be awarded to Roman citizens. Augustus understood that large quantities of Roman gold and silver were passing into the hands of Arab merchants through the incense traffic and trade. This was an outpouring of finite imperial bullion to acquire a renewable resource. Why then shouldn't the Romans possess this region and control the substance that was most sacred to their gods? Strabo reports. A report had prevailed from early times that the Arabians had become very wealthy from trading aromatics and valuable gemstones for gold and silver, but they never exchanged any part of this accumulated wealth with outsiders. Augustus therefore expected to deal with wealthy allies, or master wealthy enemies. With this conquest, the Romans could even dream of outflanking the rival Parthian Empire, which dominated Iran and controlled the Persian Gulf. And so, war. In preparation, the Roman governor of Egypt, Aelius Gallus, was given command of 10,000 soldiers. At first, the Romans assumed that a seaborne campaign conducted through the Red Sea would provide the best route to reach the Sabaean kingdom. But reports were not favorable. The Red Sea coasts of Arabia were barren and largely inaccessible due to strong tidal currents and dangerous uncharted reefs. It was therefore decided that the Roman conquest of Arabia would be a full-scale landward invasion through the hostile desert along the mysterious caravan routes. Gallus crossed from Egypt into the neighbouring kingdom of Nabatea in northwest Arabia. This territory was still subject to the empire, and the Roman army was received and resupplied at the oasis city of Petra. In neighbouring Judea, King Herod the Great sent 500 desert-equipped soldiers to assist the Romans on their campaign. Led by Nabatean military guides, the legionaries marched past the giant rock-cut edifices that flanked the main routes into Petra. They must have marvelled at the salmon-coloured cliffs and the massive, ornate buildings carved onto these steep rock facades. This was only the outer frontier of the lucrative incense trails that extended vast distances across the shifting sands. Surely there were greater wonders in the as-yet unexplored desert itself. The campaign force successfully captured a series of oasis towns and outposts which became a network for future Roman travel. But but their progress was extremely slow, and after 6 months on the outbound operations, their supplies dwindled. A suspicion began to form in the minds of some soldiers crossing the forbidding terrain. What if the Nabateans had contrived some treachery against the Romans to preserve their own stake in the lucrative incense trade? But finally, the Romans did reach the Sabaean kingdom on the southern edge of Arabia. Rocky hills rose into view and groves of palm trees and cultivated fields became more frequent. Great dams had been constructed to collect streams from the coastal highlands to irrigate this desert periphery. Crops provided sustenance for cluttered mud brick cities encircled by tall walls. On the plains before the settlements, ranks of disciplined legionaries formed up to engage poorly equipped mob-like defenders with little experience in professional warfare. The Sabaean army fled to their cities and prepared to defend their walled capital, Marib. The legions had almost reached their objective, but as the siege of Marib began, a mysterious affliction spread throughout the troops. Their limbs weakened and their teeth began to loosen in their mouths. Maybe they were offending the gods by seeking to possess the incense. Had the stricken Roman army fallen from divine favor? The effects were real and the psychological impact traumatic. Roman medics could not diagnose the true cause of this unknown ailment, and they urged Gallus to withdraw before the entire army succumbed. Perhaps the condition was scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C in the campaign diet. The Nabatean supply lines must have been at their maximum capacity, and the Sabaeans would have stripped all food resources from the land as they retreated within their walled cities. And so finally, the increasingly diminished and demoralized Roman army began a desperate retreat north to Nabatean territory. Strabo reports. Gallus was informed by his captives that he was only 2 days' journey from the country that produces aromatics, but he had used up 6 months on his outbound marches because of bad guidance. Gallus reached Petra in 60 days, but many soldiers had died on the journey due to hardships, disease, and insufficient supplies. Gallus possibly went on to report that something in the water of southern Arabia was harmful to people from Mediterranean climates. And so even though Arabia had been invaded and explored, Augustus concluded that it could never be permanently conquered or added to the Roman domains. This route to India was closed. In 52 AD, a group of distinguished royal envoys from a remote kingdom were ushered into the audience hall of the Roman Emperor Claudius. These astonishing strangers with their dark complexions were from the far south. They were the mysterious Counterlanders, who lived beneath another sky and witnessed the influence of different stars. Pliny records, the envoys marveled at the new aspect of the heavens visible in our country. They observed the stars that formed the Great Bear, the Little Bear, and the Pleiades. They told us that in their own country even the moon only appears above the horizon from the 8th to the 18th day of the month. They said that Canopus, a large and brilliant star, lights their sky by night. But what surprised them most was that their shadows fell towards our sky and not towards theirs. Also, the sun rose on the left hand of the observer and set upon the right. These Counterlanders came from an island on the outer edge of India, known to Greek and Roman merchants as Taprobane, ancient Sri Lanka. This was the most distant diplomatic contact the Roman Empire had ever received. It seems that a tax-collecting Roman businessman had made contact with this semi-legendary region. The result was this remarkable event, the arrival of distant envoys seeking opportunities for political friendship and commercial alliance in Rome. But this wasn't the first time the Indian subcontinent had come into contact with the Greco-Roman world. Half a millennium earlier, in 518 BC, The first Greeks to explore India had arrived as part of the Persian army, commanded by the Achaemenid king Darius the Great. Herodotus reports. Darius discovered the greatest part of Asia. He observed how crocodiles could be seen in the Indus River, just like the Nile. Wishing to know how it connected to the sea, he sent a team of trustworthy men, including Scylax of Carianda, to sail down the river. They sailed westward, and after a voyage of 30 months, they reached a place in Egypt. Once the voyage was completed, Darius conquered the Indus, and the Persians made use of the sea in those regions. 2 centuries later, Alexander the Great led his Greco-Macedonian armies towards India on his own mission of conquest and exploration. In the high mountain passes leading to the Hindu Kush, his homesick soldiers thought they detected signs of their own gods and heroes who travelled to this remote region. Could the wild vines and creepers growing near Nysa be evidence that Bacchus, the Greek god of revelry and wine, had passed by this ancient city? And perhaps the mountain people who fought with clubs and wore animal skins were followers of Hercules. Alexander launched his fleet on the Indus River to support his army on its progress south towards the ocean that encircled the whole world. Marvels were seen on the coast, including giant, vivid-coloured clams with folded bivalve shells. Out at sea, the humps of blue whales rose and fell on the ocean foam, suggesting the presence of great leviathans in the unknown depths. Large whales live in the outer ocean, and there are fishes much larger than those that exist in our inland sea. Nearchus reports that when they departed at daybreak, they saw water being blown upwards from the sea as if it was being propelled by the force of a waterspout. The crew were astonished and asked the pilots of the fleet what might be causing this disturbance. They replied that creatures roving about the ocean will spout up water to a great height. The sailors were so startled by this sight that the oars fell from their hands, but Nearchus encouraged and cheered them onwards. As he sailed past the galleys, he signalled to them to turn their bows towards the whales as if to give battle. Then, raising their war cry, they advanced with rapid strokes of the oars. With this great sound, the sailors regained their courage. Then, as they neared the monsters, they shouted with all their effort. Bugles blared, and the oars pounded the water. The whales, now visible at the bows of the ships, were terrified and dived into the depths. Under the command of Alexander, Greek military fleets could have explored the outer limits of the Indian Ocean, but this was not to be. Plans were made for the conquest of southern Arabia, but when Alexander died mysteriously in Babylonia, his empire was divided between generals who claimed royal titles and established regional dynasties. The possibility of trade and communication with far-off India was lost for nearly 2 centuries. And so it wasn't until 118 BC, in one of the kingdoms founded by Alexander's generals, Ptolemaic Egypt, that contact between West and East was once again made. The House of Ptolemy had established ports and harbours on the Red Sea coast and had sent Greek hunting parties south by ship to capture live African elephants. This created a military network with an infrastructure through the eastern desert to ports furnished for distant voyages. By chance, one of these royal ships encountered a strange wreck with a lone survivor clinging to its wooden frame. Strabo explains. According to the account, a certain Indian was brought to the king by the patrol ships that sail the Gulf next to Arabia. They said they had found him alone and half dead on a stranded ship. The king placed the Indian under the charge of Greek instructors so that he could learn our language. When he had learned Greek, he explained that he had been on a voyage from India. His ship had lost its course due to a strange mischance, and only after all his companions had died from starvation, he had safely reached Egypt. When his story was doubted, he promised to act as a guide on the journey to India. A group of men were selected by the king, and Eudoxus became a member of this group. Eudoxus was a man inclined to search out and explore the peculiarities of new regions, and he was well informed about nature. Departing on his first voyage in 118 BC, Eudoxus reached the Indus kingdoms to return with a rich cargo of spices, pearls, and precious stones. From this moment onwards, the realms of India were within reach of the boldest Mediterranean merchants who made voyages across the distant ocean. But this commerce did not reach its full potential for almost a century, until Rome annexed Egypt and Augustus was proclaimed the first emperor. At the beginning of the 1st century AD, Roman ships did not sail beyond the west coast of India. The deep-hulled merchant vessels were too large and cumbersome to safely navigate the line of reefs, swells, and shallows that extended from India to Sri Lanka. And so this island, known to the Romans as Taprobane, was therefore unexplored territory. Roman seafarers even feared that Taprobane might be the outer edge of some vast southern continent, the Antipodes as suggested by Pythagorean theory, vast land masses or separate other worlds occupying the southern hemisphere. But these speculations were finally challenged in AD 52 during the reign of Claudius with the arrival of the Counterlanders. Pliny relays the story of why the Counterlander envoys were sent to Rome, starting with another Roman trade vessel ship blown off course. Taprobane, also known as the territory of the Counterlanders, was long considered to be another world. That is, until Annaeus Placamus had obtained a contract from the state treasury to collect Red Sea taxes. One of his freeman agents was sailing around Arabia when he was carried by gale-force winds from the north and swept beyond the coast of Carmania. After a fortnight, they made the harbour of Hippuri in Taprobane. The unfamiliar-looking lost Roman tax collector had been taken to the Sinhalese king and his extraordinary cargo inspected by royal agents. The strange vessel and its prized cargo seemed astonishing. The ship was carrying a large consignment of high-value imperial gold and silver coinage that had been destined for the southern Arabian incense markets. The Sinhalese king and his royal ministers carefully examined the foreign coins. They scrutinized the metallic faces of distant rulers and marveled at the fine, dye-struck portraits of Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, and Claudius. The reverse of these coins depicted the outlines of strange buildings, foreign temples, and the images of unknown gods. Within 6 months, the Roman traveller had learnt the local language and could converse with his hosts. Could the accounts he told them of his home in a great Western civilization possibly be true? Pliny records how the Sinhalese king sent envoys to investigate the Roman Empire and introduce the Anuradhapura realm as a political ally and commercial associate. Indeed, one of the final notable acts of the Emperor Claudius was to receive and acknowledge these exotic ambassadors. This meant that during his time as emperor, Claudius had both occupied Britain and established diplomatic contacts with Sri Lanka, 2 distant islands on opposite edges of the earth. After this remarkable contact, Roman ships began making direct ocean crossings to Sri Lanka and the Anuradhapura kingdom. Roman captains developed faster voyages across the ocean, and by sailing around Sri Lanka, they extended their ventures to trade ports in East India, the Ganges, and Burma. A series of ambitious unnamed merchants, each prepared to undertake longer and riskier voyages, added to the range and scope of Roman trade contacts across the vast Eastern Ocean. These commercial explorers headed ever further east, tracking rumors and distant contacts towards the mysterious Ceres, the Silk people at the edge of the known world. And so the Romans kept pushing the boundaries of their knowledge. Centurions from the Praetorian Guard had trekked for weeks through the canyon deserts of Nubia, south of Egypt. Now, finally, they were entering the royal audience hall of the King of Meroe, the leading African kingdom in these distant lands. These Roman officers, caked with the debris and dust of long-distance travel, had journeyed more than 900 miles from the frontiers of Egypt. The empire had already conquered and controlled the Mediterranean coastline of North Africa that faced southern Europe, but this narrow strip was only a fraction of the vast African continent. Inland from the fertile coastal zones, Africa became increasingly arid as it merged into desert wastelands. The Sahara Desert covering North Africa with a belt of barren land almost 3,000 miles wide, stretching from the Red Sea to the Atlantic Ocean. Extending nearly 1,000 miles from north to south, it had an expanse larger than the landmass of the entire Roman Empire. In the ancient past, Berber caravans with knowledge of wells and oasis stations were able to cross this brutal landscape, but the extreme conditions confined the Romans to the seaboard fringe of North Africa. Though there was another route across this desert expanse. After the Romans conquered Egypt, they had gained control over the northern part of the Nile River, but they were reluctant to extend their rule south into the barren wastes. Now, finally, they were entering the royal audience hall of the King of Meroe, the leading African kingdom in these distant lands. This zone was under the control of an African kingdom known as Meroe, or Ancient Kush. The earliest Greek legends recalled an era when the people of Kush conquered Egypt, and African pharaohs with distinctive dark complexions commanded a unified Nilotic kingdom. The 25th dynasty that had ruled Egypt during the 8th century BC was contemporary with the famous Greek author Homer, who composed the Iliad and the Odyssey. Homer had recited the legend of Memnon, the champion king of Kush who led an African army north to support the Trojans in their war against the Greeks. Memnon was a warrior of great skill and valor, but he was slain in epic combat with the supreme Greek hero Achilles. The Romans regarded the Trojans as their legendary ancestors. So how should they view Meroe? Surely as potential allies. Based on Greek knowledge of Africa, the Romans believed that the continent terminated just south of the vast Sahara Desert. Early accounts had confirmed that these distant territories contained bush savannas and semi-forested regions. These were the homelands of Africans known collectively as Ethiopians. Pythagorean theory also suggested that nature had created symmetry and all natural phenomena had an equivalent opposite. Africa, therefore, had similar dimensions to Europe, and the Nile was expected to follow an east-west direction equivalent to the Danube River. But where was its origin? Determined to learn the truth of the Great River, the Emperor Augustus sent a Roman army into the Central Sahara, led by a commander named Cornelius Balbus. And in 20 BC, Balbus crossed the inner desert, headed towards the Fezzan region of southern Libya. He conducted a rapid campaign, marching 600 miles south from Reggio Tripolitania on a course through the open desert that took at least 24 days to accomplish. The Romans captured the main oasis centers of Garamantia, but their engineers were utterly perplexed by the outflow of endless fresh water the Garamantes had access to. They reasoned that perhaps the Garamantes had tapped into a vast underground river. Did the Nile actually flow beneath the desert? In reality, the Garamantes were accessing prehistoric aquifers. These underground water sources were the residue of vast upland lakes that had seeped below the earth in earlier millennia. The Romans who surveyed this arid terrain did not understand the true age of the earth, nor could they begin to fathom the extraordinary alterations caused by changes in climate. Thus, the underground river theory provided a credible explanation for hidden water sources. Beyond this, all Balbus discovered was desert. Though he did celebrate a triumph in Rome, the empire withdrew from Garamantic territory. It seems that Augustus and his successors were prepared to leave the mystery of the Nile and its emergence unanswered. But this wasn't the case for long. For when the Romans seized direct control over the subject kingdom of Mauritania in AD 40, new discoveries were made. Ancient Mauritania was situated on the Mediterranean seaboard of northwest Africa, stretching from Algeria to Morocco. The sudden Roman annexation provoked an uprising on the desert frontiers. 2 legionary armies were redeployed to suppress the rebellion. One of the commanders, a man named Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, and Gaius was an ambitious man. In AD 41, Paulinus marched his army south, towards the Atlas Mountains that formed the furthest limits of the kingdom. He led his legionaries through sweltering forests on the edge of Morocco and encountered strange and startling animals, including tarantulas, scorpions, and bizarre monkeys. Undeterred, Paulinus ascended and crossed the Atlas Range, passing beneath African peaks still covered with snow even during the heat of summer. From these high vistas, Paulinus surveyed the landscape beyond the mountains and saw the glint of a river flowing on the arid desert plains below. He led his troops down into the scorching black sand desert, but when they reached the distant river, they discovered it to be nothing but a weak trickle, meandering through barren lands. Paulinus abandoned his expedition, and so this was the furthest territory that the Romans had explored, but there was still no sign of the western Nile. Pliny the Elder hinted at the true purpose of the mission. An exploring party was recently sent by the Emperor Nero. It seems that, among his other wars, he is actually contemplating an attack on Ethiopia, Inner Africa. And so, in AD 61, the Praetorians left Roman territory in Egypt and headed south to seek an audience with the king of Meroe. Posing as diplomats and explorers, the Roman party took careful note of distances and resources on an estimated 945-mile trek from Syene to the royal capital of Meroe. Ancient Egyptian texts recorded about 25 urban centers along the Nubian Nile. However, on their trek south, the Romans discovered that most of these settlements had been abandoned centuries earlier. Praetorians following the course of the Nile examined dry, crumbling ruins of outposts and temples, built by past civilizations of immense antiquity. Based on these reports, Pliny argued, it was not Rome that made this country a desert. This region was worn out by alternate periods of dominance and subjection in a series of wars with Egypt, having been a famous and powerful country even down to the time of the Trojan Wars. This Nubian desert ended near the outskirts of Meroe. Here the land finally became fertile and forested, Pliny records. Greener herbage appears near the city and stretches of forest come into view where the tracks of rhinos and elephants can be seen. On arrival at Meroe, the trail-weary Praetorians declared their status as envoys and asked for an audience with the ruler of the city. They were eventually taken to the royal audience chamber. In the gloom of the temple-like palace hall, towering stone statues loomed from between ornamental pillars. Tall reliefs displayed images of strange, lion-headed gods, but also disturbing scenes of past conflicts. A century earlier, Meroitic armies had stormed the frontier city of Syene in southern Egypt, taking some Roman prisoners and decapitating bronze statues of the Emperor Augustus. Some reliefs in Meroe depicted Roman soldiers made to kneel in submission. It was a reminder that Rome was not always triumphant on the edges of its empire. The leading tribune of the Praetorians stepped forward to request a favor from the African king. A message from the Golden Emperor Nero, the ruler of mighty army, Imperial Rome. For Nero wanted something from Inner Africa. The Praetorians waited while the king considered his response. The acrid scent of Somali incense filled the audience hall, drifting through shafts of brilliant sunlight and penetrating through elevated openings near the ceiling. Unfamiliar faces with uniquely dark complexions scrutinized the new Roman arrivals. Exhausted by their travels through strange and arid lands, the Praetorians must have struggled to maintain their composure. Their fear and unease was justified. Meroe was not a subject nation, and Rome had no dominion here. But the king of Meroe offered them support. Seneca confirms. The king supplied them with assistance and gave them letters of introduction to the neighboring rulers. Then they set out on their long journey into the center of Africa. But the course of the Nile did not extend westward as most Roman authorities had supposed. The Praetorians instead found themselves pushing deeper into Africa, following the White Nile south 600 miles until they reached a seemingly impassable barrier: the Sud. The Sud is a primordial wetland in southern Sudan, filled with ferns, fields of papyrus reeds, and thick mats of rotting vegetation. In the rainy season, it becomes a vast, humid swamp, teeming with mosquitoes and other insects. Those who entered this region had to endure sweltering heat, the fear of disease, and the threat of starvation. The Sud was too deep to be safely crossed on foot, yet the water was too shallow to be explored any further by boat. It was also vast. It included almost 300 miles of swollen wetland. The heavy clay soils retained and expanded the outflow of semi-stagnant water far beyond the vision of any explorers. The water teemed with strange, sharp-finned fish, and the explorers must have had to keep keen watch for the outlines of crocodiles amongst the drifting debris. The dense, hulking shapes of hippopotami would watch, half submerged, snorting in sputtering bursts as the travelers passed by. They were to be avoided in case these monstrous animals decided to charge, gore, or batter crew and craft. The Praetorians must have realized that these beasts were large and powerful enough to overturn and smash their small vessels. What use could their swords and javelins be? And all the while, the persistent sun blazed down upon this wretched landscape. These sluggish pools teemed with clouds of incessant mosquitoes, and even at microscopic level, the water was a living poison. Minuscule waterborne parasites would have infected the bladder and kidneys, causing skin irritations, stomach cramps, and diarrhea. Skin sores, cuts, and lesions would not heal in this infected, decaying environment. It must have seemed to the despairing Romans that they had reached the chaotic and primordial edge of nature, where matter became indistinct and creation was half-formed. Finally, sodden and exhausted, the Praetorians could go no further. The tribune gazed out across the endless, shimmering haze of swamp and gave the order: turn back. On their return to Italy, the Roman explorers told Seneca, "We came to great swamps, the borders of which even the natives did not know. We could not find the limits of this place. The river was completely entangled with vegetable growth and the waters were impassable by foot because of the muddy overgrowth. But we saw 2 rocks from which an immense quantity of water issued. Perhaps they prudently suggested this was one of the underground sources of the Nile, issuing forth like a fountain to flood the land." From the reports given by the explorers, Roman cartographers prepared a diagram that outlined the major invasion routes into sub-Saharan Africa. Pliny describes this object as the schematic plan of Ethiopia, recently presented to the Emperor Nero. And so Nero set his plans into action. An imperial residence was prepared in the Egyptian capital of Alexandria, and troops were sent to the city in preparation for an imminent campaign. Legions X Fretensis and V Macedonica were sent to Egypt to extend Roman rule deep into Africa. But it was not to be. There was an uprising against the Romans in Judea at the same time as the legions in northern Europe rebelled against the emperor. Eventually, even the Praetorians withdrew their support and the Senate declared Nero an enemy of the state. The fugitive emperor fled the imperial palace and took his own life rather than suffer the pain and humiliation of a public execution. The Romans would never find the true source of the Nile, and soon their probing reach would change its focus and turn northwards. Much of northern Europe was covered in a dense and ancient woodland, known to the Romans as the Hercynian forest. Tall, deciduous trees towered over the thick, leaf-matted forest floor, creating a gloomy canopy that hemmed in and overshadowed anyone moving through this vast and claustrophobic expanse. It was a disorientating wilderness, utterly savage and disconcerting for Roman travelers. Savage, wild animals lived in these places, and hostile Germanic tribesfolk could stalk or ambush those who trespassed through their dark domains. Indeed, scattered somewhere in this silent, eerie forest was the scene of an atrocity: the Teutoburg Massacre. Butchered remains of 3 entire legions littered the forest floor, their corpses desecrated and displayed on trees in strange Germanic customs, presented as offerings to savage, hostile gods. What could possibly tempt Roman adventurers to brave this wilderness? The answer was amber resin. Early Greek theory suggested that amber was the congealed rays of the sun as it set into a frozen atmosphere. Of course, it had already been established that the cold of northern regions could turn seawater into a solid substance and condense the air into an impenetrable fog. But over time, this idea had changed. Burning amber chippings produced the smell of pine sap, and there were strange and exotic insects, scorpions, beetles, and wasps embedded in the solidified substance. This would suggest that the material was probably some sort of tree resin. However, the process that transformed sap to gem was unknown. Might the Romans discover the mystery? Was there a land of perpetual daylight concealed in the far north? And so, as in Africa, Nero's interest had been piqued. Another envoy had returned to Rome, having undertaken a distant mission far beyond the frontiers of the empire for the emperor. He had followed trade routes north beyond the Danube frontiers, crossing 600 miles of hostile and unknown territory to acquire a valuable prize: a mysterious resource from the frozen oceans of the far north: Baltic amber. A fossilized tree resin found in deep subsurface sediments on the Baltic coast, it was the remains of a vast coniferous forest from the Eocene epoch over 44 million years ago. The erosion of this strata by turbulent North Sea storms and tidal flows cast this amber onto the shores where it was gathered by ancient peoples. Germanic populations offered amber to the ancient Britons and conveyed it inland through the rivers of Central Europe to reach outposts of classical civilizations in the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Centuries before the Roman era, amber from the Baltic coasts of the North Sea had reached the Greek world. It was cut, ground, and polished into ornaments, and these bright, translucent orbs had the value of precious gemstones. A strange and intriguing material, it was used to adorn Greek necklaces and decorate the shields of Carthaginian soldiers. Greek myth had suggested that pieces of amber were the tears shed by the sisters of Phaethon when they heard of his demise. They were the offspring of Helios, the sun god, who had allowed his child Phaethon, the semi-divine youth, to drive the sun chariot. But the boy had lost control of the speeding vehicle and tumbled to his death, somewhere in the frozen north. In Roman Syria, amber was prized for the household craft of spinning yarns. It had electrostatic properties and would draw fibers and threads towards the spindle. Amber was therefore known as harpax, or the snatcher. Pliny observed that when amber was warmed by rubbing, it could pick up dry leaves or straw and catch the fine fringes of garments. Noting these strange properties, the Greeks had called amber electrum, or the shining one. Yet the peoples of northern Europe had remained distant and unknown to the Romans until the outbreak of the Cimbric War. In about 120 BC, a sudden environmental shift caused great flood tides around the Jutland Peninsula, destroying farmlands, herds, and habitats. Faced with starvation, the Germanic peoples known as the Cimbri and Teutons began a mass migration into Gaul. Merging with Celtic warriors and moving with their families, they became an invasion force as they pushed south towards Roman Italy. In 101 BC, after more than a decade of conflict, the Roman legions finally defeated and destroyed the last of these Germanic invaders. But the distant homelands of these people remained a curious mystery. But the Roman annexation of Germania finally began in 16 BC, when the first Emperor Augustus placed his adopted son Nero Claudius Drusus in command of the legions and tasked him with a great campaign of conquest and exploration. Crossing the Rhine, the armies led by Drusus reached the Elbe River, which flows into the North Sea near the Jutland Peninsula. When Drusus died from an injury on campaign, Augustus appointed his successor Tiberius as the replacement commander, who launched several seaward operations as far as the Jutland Peninsula and secured Greater Germania for the empire. Augustus boasted of these achievements in his memorial statement. "I restored the provinces of Gaul and Spain and pacified Germany, securing the ocean from Cadiz to the mouth of the river Elbe. I commanded my ships to sail the ocean from the mouth of the Rhine east to the lands bordering the Cimbri, where no Roman had gone before, either by land or sea." But the Roman advance into Germania Interior would not be a lasting conquest. In AD 9, the Germans staged a rebellion and massacred 3 entire legions in the dark and wild Teutoburg forest. The elderly Augustus suffered a severe reaction when he heard this news, never fully recovering, and so Drusus and Tiberius seem to have set the limits for Roman knowledge and expansion on the northern fringe of Europe. To many Romans, it seemed as if they were fighting against nature itself in their efforts to conquer and pacify Germania. The Emperor Tiberius continued the conflict, but in AD 16, the Roman fleet was caught in a severe storm while ferrying a land army from the Ems River back to the Rhine frontier. The disaster was described by a Roman poet named Albinovanus Pedo. The work itself has not survived, but a passage quoted by Seneca clearly expresses Roman fears about the Northern Ocean. Pedo wrote, "They witness daylight, but the sun is left far behind. They are long exiled from the well-known limits of the world. They have dared to go into the forbidden, gloom-filled territories at the edge of creation to try and reach its farthest shores. Now they behold the ocean, which has monsters beneath its sluggish waves. On all sides are savage sharks and dogs of the sea. Crashing waves and wrathful, billowing winds seize their ships, rising them high in the water and swelling them with fear. As their fleet is caught by swift winds, they feel their ships impacting on a shoal. The remorseless fates will mangle them or deliver them to the wild creatures of the ocean. One man stands defiant on the high prow. He cries out the thoughts of his imprisoned soul. Where are we being taken by the storm? Should we even be searching for nations who dwell beyond another sky? We are violating foreign seas and sacred waters with our oars. Why do we trouble the untouched dwelling places of the gods?" During the storm, the great fleet was smashed apart and dispersed with an enormous loss of life. In the aftermath of the disaster, Tiberius finally abandoned Roman plans to recover the region, and Greater Germania remained permanently outside the empire. Due to this decision, Baltic territories beyond the Jutland Peninsula remained poorly explored by Roman authorities. In his Natural History, completed in AD 75, Pliny the Elder still relies on the accounts of Pytheas to describe the territories beyond Jutland. Pytheas says that a German people called the Gutones inhabited the shores of an estuary on the ocean called Mentonomon. Their territory extends 6,000 stadia. The islanders burn amber as fuel or trade it with their neighbours. The Gutones are possible ancestors of the Goths, who centuries later would invade the Roman Empire, contributing to its decline, fragmentation, and eventual collapse. North, south, east, and west, had the Roman Empire finally reached the ends of the earth? The Romans had finally broken through. They had completed a sudden and relentless march through the mountains on the west flank of Britain. Finally reaching the uncharted west coast, they now stood on the very shores of the Irish Sea. Within their sight lay the island of Mona, a sacred druidic centre and powerful base for Celtic opposition to Rome. This force was commanded by the governor Suetonius Paullinus, the same man who had crossed the high Atlas Mountains in North Africa 2 decades earlier. Now he found himself in the mountainous landscape of Wales, receiving the final details of the coming attack against the Celtic resistance. He had summoned his senior military staff to the campaign tent to explain their orders, and among them was a young 20-year-old tribune named Gnaeus Julius Agricola. The Druids and the leaders of the Celtic resistance had considered themselves invulnerable within their island stronghold of Mona, but Paullinus had a plan. Under the orders of Paullinus, the Classis Britannica had constructed special flat-bottom landing craft. The fleet would convey the assembled legions across the narrow Menai Strait to assault the sacred island. But as the Romans prepared to disembark on the shores of Mona, a hideous sight was revealed. For the Druids had prepared an army of Celtic tribes. A fanatical enemy was invoking terrible curses on the incoming legionaries. Black-clad priestess carrying flaming torches ran between the ranks of frenzied warriors shrieking like crows. Fearful paralysis gripped the Romans. Perhaps there were indeed mystic powers and evil entities on the fringes of the known world. For a long time, the Greeks and Romans had feared and respected the ancient Celts. People from classical civilizations recognized common motifs and images amongst the cattle-raising cultures of northwest Europe. Indeed, early Greek myths of Hercules may have been influenced by the Celtic gods as they appeared on early artifacts or religious items. Lieu of the Long Arm was a radiant Celtic warrior god who encouraged cattle raids. Master of the spear and slingshot, adept at oratory and unsurpassed in all the artisan skills of craftsmanship, he was represented with 3 heads, symbolizing the 3 great aspects of his supernatural character. The Coleg head from ancient Ireland depicts the deity with 3 separate faces on a single stone cranium. In early Greek myths, the 10th great labor of Hercules was to enter the distant Atlantic and steal the red cattle of the monstrous giant Geryon. Geryon was a triple-headed entity with a fearsome hound that guarded his island home in the far west. But perhaps the Romans were right to fear Celtic rituals. Julius Caesar himself had heard reports that the continental Celts burned sacrificial victims in giant wicker structures, whilst leading 2 expeditions into southern Britain in 55 and 54 BC, suppressing tribes who had supported the Gauls against Rome. The Celtic islands had other strange sights and wonders, such as extraordinary war horns known as carnyx. These tall instruments were shaped like gaping mouths of hideous creatures, and some had hinged tongues that clacked as the warriors advanced. In a Celtic army, the trumpet-like horns projected far above the heads of the tallest warriors, so that the monstrous, howling creatures seemed to join and jostle for place in the frenzied battle line. And so, in preparation for combat with these distant horrors, the Emperor Claudius brought his own monsters to Britain when he invaded the island in AD 43. War elephants. The Celts venerated bristle-backed wild boars as powerful warrior totems, so massive elephants, with their long tusks and trumpeting roar, were truly horrifying. Claudius's victory in Britain was seen as a triumph over the great northern ocean itself. Suetonius describes the ceremonies in Rome, where, among the spoils of victory, Claudius fixed a naval crown next to the civic crown on the pediment of the Palatine Palace. This was a sign that he had crossed over and conquered the ocean. Suetonius Paullinus, the Roman general who crossed the high Atlas Mountains, became the governor of Britannia in AD 58. The small, offshore province of Britain was well established, but most of the island remained beyond Roman control. Paullinus was given the position by Nero, but he still maintained his own personal motives and interests. In particular, he was keen to outdo the exploits of a contemporary named Corbulo, who was conducting a dangerous war against the Parthians in mountainous Armenia. Compelled by this rivalry, Paulinus led his own military expedition into unknown, hostile British territories. Perhaps it was Nero who encouraged renewed action on the frontiers, or maybe Paulinus was inspired by current events. Indeed, in the south, Praetorians were exploring the Nile, and Iniquites had embarked north to find the distant source of amber. Could Paulinus not do likewise? He could lead his legions to the western edge of Britain and look across the Irish Sea at the furthest unconquered lands. How could Nero, with his fascination with exploration and distant lands, possibly object? And so, Paulinus had marched his legions westward, Tacitus reports. Now, Britain was under the command of Suetonius Paulinus, a man who vied with Corbulo in attaining military experience and popular favour. Paulinus therefore prepared to attack the island of Mona, which had a powerful population and was a refuge for fugitives. On the opposite shore stood the opposing army with a dense array of well-armed warriors. Between their ranks dashed women with their hair dishevelled, dressed in black attire like the Furies and waving firebrands. All around were the Druids, lifting their hands up to heaven and pouring forth dreadful incantations. Our soldiers were terrified by this unfamiliar sight and paused as if their limbs were paralyzed. They stood motionless and exposed to wounds. Eventually, Paulinus yelled the orders: "Advance in order! Charge!" The spell was broken and the ranks advanced. It was soon over. The well-organized soldiers butchered the enemy and burnt their sacred groves. Another enemy of Rome had been destroyed. The young Agricola participated in the military actions, learning the skills and attitudes that would one day inform and guide his own decisions in high office. But as the Romans dismantled the Celtic shrines, news suddenly reached Paulinus that the province of Britain was in revolt. On the east coast, the previously submissive Iceni tribe had rebelled. Their queen, Boudica, rearmed her people and inflicted devastation on the poorly defended Roman communities. Paulinus led a rushed and desperate march back across the mountains to rescue the province. Though the outnumbered Romans were victorious in battle, the damage had been done. Entire populations were butchered or fled as refugees, as the new colonies and cities were burnt or abandoned. Nero considered withdrawing the legions permanently from Britain, but for the sake of honor, the province was retained. Nevertheless, lessons were learnt and further expansion halted for more than a decade. Writing in AD 75, Pliny claims that Britain had not been explored beyond the Caledonian Forest, ancient Scotland. And so, in the far north, at the crest of the world, what lay beyond? And who would dare to make this journey? During the political high point of the Roman Empire, two distant travelers met by chance at the sacred site of Delphi in central Greece. They began discussing the extent and form of the world as revealed by ancient texts and their own explorations in faraway lands on the edge of the empire. An account of their conversation was recorded by the Greek writer Plutarch, who says his brother Lamprias joined the travelers in their discussions. Delphi was considered to be the sacred cultural center of Greece and the midpoint of the entire ancient world. It was known as the Omphalos, or the navel of the earth. A myth described how Zeus had simultaneously launched two eagles from the opposite edges of the globe, and the birds met one another in the skies directly above Delphi. The two travelers were Cleombrotus of Sparta and Demetrius of Tarsus, and like the eagles of Zeus, each had returned from opposite edges of the known world. Cleombrotus was a wealthy traveller from the ancient territory of Sparta in southern Greece. He had journeyed for knowledge and experience across the entire ocean to India. Plutarch writes, "The journeys by Cleombrotus were not for business. He was fond of seeing things and of acquiring knowledge. He had sufficient wealth and felt that it was not any great advantage to have more than enough, so he spent his leisure time involved in travelling and inquiry. But Demetrius was different. He had been on a very different mission. He was a grammarian, a language expert who had been recruited as a military agent and had been on an imperial assignment to the mysterious Celtic islands off the northwest coast of Britain. Plutarch writes, Demetrius said that there were many isolated islands positioned near Britain. These islands had few or no inhabitants, and some bore the names of divinities or heroes. He himself, by the emperor's order, had made a voyage for inquiry and observation to the nearest of these lands. Agricola, the governor of Great Britain, had requested Greek intellectuals for some great venture in the North Atlantic. Demetrius had answered this call. In his role as an imperial agent, he had been sent to isolated islands off the coast of ancient Britain, probably travelling aboard a Roman war galley, one of many that had been sent to explore and map a series of islands and coastlines located to the west of Britain and the north of Ireland. The sudden approach of an Atlantic storm drove the ship and its crew to seek shelter ashore. The Roman explorers were forced to take refuge on some strange island for several days. Intrigued by this edge-of-the-world territory, Demetrius managed to communicate with the inhabitants in their own dialect, and was told they were trespassing on a holy island. Somewhere nearby was the resting place of a dormant god that Demetrius identified as Kronos. The Greek god Kronos was the primordial being overthrown by Zeus. Demetrius would have also heard stories about the vast ceremonial mounds of prehistoric peoples who lived thousands of years before the Celts, and mysterious stone circles constructed by Neolithic populations. Roman galleys charting the north coast of Ireland would have already seen the giant paved causeway extending from the rugged coast into the depths of the sea. This undersea causeway rose again on a dark island where a vast, multi-columned cave emitted strange, acoustic thrummings. This unique natural feature on the island of Staffa is known in modern times as Fingal's Cave. The close-fitting hexagonal stones of the giant's causeway and Fingal's Cave must have been viewed as the work of deities or great heroes. It was clear that the Roman fleet was trespassing on the outer world of the gods. And other questions had to be solved if the Romans hoped to master this new northern environment. Was Britain an island of unparalleled size, or simply the outer reaches of some great northern counterland that extended deep into the hostile Arctic zone? Did this landmass have a terminus? Even halfway across the world, Britain was famous for its mysterious size. In AD 66, the Jewish king Herod Agrippa had made a speech to his people on the eve of a failed revolt. Josephus reports, "Do not depend upon the walls of Jerusalem. The Romans have sought another habitable earth beyond the ocean. They have landed armies on British islands which were never known before. Consider what a barrier the Britons had. They were encircled by the ocean, and yet the Romans sailed across and subdued them. And the Britons inhabit a landmass that may not be smaller than this entire inhabited earth." And so in AD 77, on the orders of the Emperor Vespasian, the newly appointed governor Gnaeus Julius Agricola was instructed to find and secure these frontiers, wherever they might turn out to be. Agricola led his Roman forces to the edge of the highlands and began establishing the Firth-Clyde frontier. This was a 40-mile-wide defensive network of forts and embankments that would form a permanent northern limit to the British province. Now a new conquest could begin, so that freedom would be removed from sight, and the Caledonians would be entirely isolated. And in AD 80, the Romans prepared their fleet for the conquest and annexation of Ireland, the final great refuge of the Celtic peoples. This was to be the emperor's final conquest and would complete their exploration of the distant west. Tacitus reports. In soil and climate, in the disposition and lifestyle of its population, Ireland differs little from Britain. The routes of approach and harbours are better known to us through commerce and merchants. It would unite the powerful parts of the empire with great mutual benefit. But unforeseen events coincided to halt the Roman invasion. In AD 81, the Emperor Titus, the eldest son of Vespasian, suddenly died after only a year in office. He was succeeded by his younger brother Domitian, who had different plans for empire. And at almost the same time, a remarkable account was circulating. It was the story of a voyage. A newly recruited cohort of Germanic auxiliaries had mutinied while stationed on the west coast of Britain. They had murdered their commanding officers and seized 3 war galleys to embark on their escape. Their aim was to search for some sea route, first north, then eastward, back to their homelands beyond the Rhine. However, the emaciated survivors had reached northern Germany on a single remaining ship, and they had been swiftly recaptured and returned to Roman authorities on the Rhine frontier. The survivors had told a remarkable story of great daring and hardships, ferocious storms, sea raids, and cannibalism. They were the living proof that some sort of sea route existed around the northern coasts of Britain. Britain was confirmed to be an island, with its furthest limits just beyond the contested Highland zone. And by coincidence, rumours now reached Agricola of a major uprising in the Highlands. In response, Agricola called off the Irish campaign and turned his full military force northward against this encroaching force of Highland Celts. The Roman fleet joined with the land forces to pursue the enemy into hostile territory, entering lochs and deep ocean inlets on the western coast of Scotland. Tacitus reports. Nowhere does the sea hold wider influence over land. The tidal currents flow this way and that, for the sea does not merely ebb and flow along the coast, but it penetrates and winds its way deep inland, placing itself amidst the ridges and mountains and forming its own domain. For the first time, the fleet was employed as an integral part of the land army, and ships accompanied this campaign. The imposing facade of war was pushed forward both by sea and land. Often, Roman infantry, cavalry, and marines shared the same encampment, cheerfully taking the same meals. They would evaluate battles on land, with victories on the ocean. 2 years of difficult campaigning followed before the Romans were able to inflict a serious defeat on their elusive enemy. Late in the summer of AD 83, Agricola led his legions deep into the highland wilderness to attack a major gathering of Caledonian warriors at a site called Mons Graupius. With this victory, Agricola could claim that Caledonia was finally subdued, and so he marched north with the legions to find the bleak limits of the land. Under his orders, the fleet based in the Clyde estuary conducted its voyage of exploration northward to confirm the outer limits of the British landmass by sea. And there, as winter was approaching, they observed another island in the far north, beyond Britain. Surely the land encountered beyond these shores must be the semi-mythical Thule, Tacitus reports. There is a vast irregular tract of land stretching out from the furthermost shore of Caledonia and tapering to a kind of wedge. This was the first time that a Roman fleet had circumnavigated this coast and crossed the remotest sea. They confirmed that Britain was indeed an island. Although they cited Thule, no landing was made, since no orders for this purpose had been issued and winter was approaching. In the next campaign season, the Romans might have followed this chain of outer islands northwards towards Iceland and the edge of the Arctic Circle. But Agricola never undertook this venture. He was recalled from Britain and the fleet never re-entered these remote seas. Further expansion had become impractical when the Emperor Domitian recalled essential troops from Britain, urgently needing to defend the threatened Danube frontier and protect long-established imperial possessions. Rome was on the defensive, and it was the embattled legions who now watched the frontiers with fear and apprehension. the captured territories in Caledonia were abandoned, and Ireland was never added to the empire. Standing on a wet promontory above the Roman fleet after the Battle of Mons Graupius, Gnaeus Julius Agricola had indeed stood at the maritime edge of the habitable world, and it would remain that way for centuries afterwards. It is the 2nd century AD. Roman civilization has reached its greatest achievements. Alexandria, the capital of Egypt, stands in the center of a vast world system that connects the most distant regions through vibrant commercial networks. Hundreds of ships deliver thousands of tons of Egyptian grain to Rome. But Alexandria also looks eastward, and its merchants could reach southern India in just 70 days. The Emperor Trajan has restored an ancient canal linking the Nile to the Suez Gulf. This allows travelers to avoid the hardships of the eastern desert on their journeys to the Red Sea ports. Italy and India are connected by trade through the great metropolis of Alexandria. And so, in the Great Library of Alexandria, Claudius Ptolemy is redrawing and expanding the world map devised by his predecessor, Marinos of Tyre. Roman political and economic power has greatly expanded classical geography, and its merchants repeatedly pass what used to be the boundaries of the known world. Unfortunately, he has miscalculated the size of the Earth, reducing it to about 72% of actual size. His landmass measurements are too large on this reduced globe, and northern Britain extends too far into the Arctic zone. Ptolemy, therefore, adjusts Caledonia by making the northern part of Britain bend west-east. This is a minor change to a territory that was no longer part of the empire, but one consequence was that Shetland is pushed eastward towards Scandinavia. But what about Thule? Ptolemy carefully reviews the map data collected by Agricola. By all accounts, Thule should be north of Britain, so he therefore plots the coordinates of Shetland on his world map and labels this landmass Thule. The Romans had finally found and mapped their Thule, and the credit went to Agricola. Advances in geographical knowledge were also occurring on the eastern edges of the known world. A merchant sailor named Alexandros wrote a new periplus that outlined Roman voyages across the eastern Indian Ocean. Roman merchant ships now reached distant kingdoms such as Burma, and by following Indian sailing routes around the Malay Peninsula, they arrived at the previously remote islands of Sumatra, Java, and Borneo. Roman sailing records suggest that beast-like satyrs inhabited these lands. These could be orangutans. The Romans called this distant sea the Bay of Sinai, because some unknown route led north to the outer territories of Han China. The furthest location on these distant voyages was a mysterious trade outpost known as Cattigara. Ptolemy records. Marinos does not provide a distance in star days for the sail from the Golden Peninsula to Cattigara. However, he does record that Alexandros had written that the land from there curves south. Those who sail along it reach the city of Zabai in 20 days, and after sailing from Zabai northeast for a few days, they reach Cattigara. Perhaps Cattigara was an eastern city, somewhere on the coast of Vietnam. It could have been visited by Chinese merchants from the nearby Han Empire, which the Romans knew as Sinai. But Roman merchants were also extending classical knowledge as they travelled eastwards along the more direct, land-based Silk routes to China. In about AD 100, merchants were sent by an influential Roman businessman named Gnaeus Titianus. They were granted passage through the rival Parthian Empire, which occupied Iran. Trekking through Bactria, ancient Afghanistan, on trade routes across the powerful Kushan Empire, their destination was a trade outpost close to the distant Pamir Mountains, known to merchants as the Stone Tower. Here, caravans coming from Indian and Iranian territories met with Tarim merchants and steppe traders. bullion and other rare substances were exchanged at the stone tower for precious Chinese silk. The Roman merchants who reached the stone tower in AD 100 seized the opportunity to travel onwards into the homelands of the mysterious Ceres, the ancient silk people. Ptolemy records. The route from the stone tower to the Ceres is subject to extreme weather, so there must have been numerous pauses on the journey. The route only became known through the opportunities for commerce. Marinos records that one Maes, also known as Titianus, a Macedonian and a merchant by family profession, recorded the distance. Maes did not travel the route himself, but sent agents to the Ceres. And so Ptolemy used the distances provided by Maes to estimate the vast size of Eastern Asia, and having settled upon the dimensions of the land of the Ceres, he turned his gaze southwards. By this era, Roman merchants, agents, and explorers had ventured further into Africa too, in pursuit of profit or on special imperial assignments. Ptolemy consulted accounts of Roman trading voyages to a distant African trading station called Rapta. Rapta was on the coast of Tanzania, near to the distant and mysterious island of Madagascar. Voyages along these coasts included sailings through the night, along shores where the coast rose steeply upward to form desolate cliffs. Ptolemy writes, Marinus records that the sailing between the aromatic promontory and Rapta was undertaken by a certain Diogenes. He was returning from India a second time when he was driven south from the promontory by a strong northern wind. He sailed south with Africa on his right for 25 days, till he reached a position near the lakes from which the Nile flows. In the AD 80s, the Emperor Domitian sent an explorer team across the central Sahara. They crossed through Garamatic territory to enter the bush savannas in the land beyond. The explorers entered inner Africa and captured a rare savanna rhino for display in Rome. Ptolemy describes how Julius Maternus spent 4 months on the outward journey to this enigmatic land. Julius Maternus travelled from Leptis Magna to Garamantia and accompanied its king on an expedition to the Ethiopians. After marching south for 4 months, they reached Agisimba in the Ethiopian country where the rhinoceros congregate. The captive African rhino was transported 1,000 miles across savanna and desert before being placed on a ship bound for Rome. There, in the newly built Colosseum, Domitian's rhino thundered across the arena to impale bulls and destroy Caledonian bears. To the amazed spectators, it was clear that the Emperor Domitian commanded animals that were superior to anything Agricola might have encountered on the northern edge of Europe. The Roman crowd realized that the African continent was extensive and its limits seemed endless. And so, looking at their world maps, the Greeks and the Romans had realized that the known Earth covered only a fraction of the globe. Seneca wondered what undiscovered lands might exist beyond the current reach of Rome. He remembered the arrival of the Sinhalese envoys, which permitted distant Sri Lanka to become a launching point for Roman voyages out into the further unknown. Would the day come when the empire could complete its Atlantic conquest and reach across the Western Ocean to other undiscovered lands? He wrote, "There will come an age in future times when the ocean shall unloose the bonds of knowledge. When the whole vast earth shall be discovered, Tethys shall reveal new worlds, and Thule shall not be the limit of the known lands." Roman civilization, through the exploits of conquest and commerce, had discovered, accessed, revealed, and mapped the ancient world as they knew it. But there was still much more to be uncovered.